Hello and welcome to GTV and the latest episode of our series Coffee at Wynns. My guest today is Kevin McDonald. Kevin is a retired senior Irish Army officer, peacekeeper, mountaineer and archaeologist. He is currently a security advisor with the UN mission in South Sudan. You're very welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Kevin, you're originally from Castlebar, County Mayo, which is, I suppose you might call a garrison town. So I suspect being a soldier was an ambition you might have wanted to have at an early age.
Certainly, because at a very early age, even when I was in national school, during the summer we could hear the gunfire from the barracks, which had a small range, and I just was so enthralled by the whole thing. And we'd see the guys going out on manoeuvres, with armoured cars and motorbikes and all that kind of stuff. And I was going, that's it. That's what I want to be. So I joined the FCA, the Reserve Defence Forces. Let's say I probably adjusted my birth certificate because I certainly wasn't old enough to join. And never lost the graw I had for serving in the military. And then subsequently, I spent 7 years with the reserve. I then enlisted in the Permanent Defence Forces. I trained in Monaghan, 1983, and then made sergeant when I was with the Ranger Wing, and then I was commissioned as an officer in 1992, and retired as a commandant in 2016, because in the Irish Army, once you reach 56 as a commandant, you have to compulsorily retire. So I've had some very good years, some very tough years, but some very good years that I would never regret. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with the military.
It's very much a vocation, isn't it, being a soldier? Because obviously, there are easier ways of making money. There's long hours. There's a long period of time away from home, and obviously you find yourself in risky situations a lot of the time.
That's true, and certainly when I joined in '83, and even now today, it's not a career you'd go into for the money. It's a career that I certainly went into because I loved it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was fortunate enough to get promoted through the NCO ranks and then get commissioned as an officer, lieutenant, captain, commandant. I've been to a lot of weird and wonderful places. Some tough missions, some not so tough. But a lot of the experiences that I've had, and a lot of the friendships I've made, like the friendships for life, because I think certainly within the Defence Forces, the friendships you make, especially friendships overseas under pressure in difficult circumstances, they're completely different from the type of, we'll say, friendships you would develop working in construction or in a shop or something like that. I think because of the robust nature of the training and also the robust nature of the missions, that they form a bond that I think all veterans will be able to understand the unique bond that they have by virtue of the fact of their service in the Defence Forces.
We'll talk about overseas service in a few minutes, but you joined the Army Rangers Wing, which is the elite sort of core of the Irish Army. I guess it would be the equivalent of the Marines.
Well, I'll go a bit tougher than that now.
Yeah, well, it would be. Well, I'm just saying that it would be the equivalent of the US Marines or whatever. How tough is that to get into, and more importantly, how tough is it to get through the training course for that?
Well, to give an example, when I started my selection course back in '85 on a Sunday afternoon in the Curragh, I think there was 58 of us. There was 12 gone by the next morning, and 11 finished the 4-week course, of which I think 10 were taken into the unit. So extremely difficult, extremely tough. Not just physically, but mentally as well. They fairly put you through the paces, or your paces, which is understandable. There's no point in kind of, lowering your standards just to get more numbers in. And certainly when I was there, we never reached our establishment because of, as I say, you need to train people hard and test them really hard, both mentally and physically, to make sure that they're a perfect fit for the unit. I mean, like, people have this idea of special forces as these being, big, huge, muscular guys that can bench press, all that kind of stuff. That's in my experience, that's not really an accurate description, although it's the description that a lot of people have from films or whatever.
Yeah.
But you need to be kind of the grey man, the guy that can operate in any given circumstances, whether it's jungles, whether it's in the mountains, whether it's in an urban environment. You need to be able to blend in and operate. And certainly, the guys that can bench press a lot of big weights aren't necessarily the best types. And it's as much cerebral as it is physical. You need to be able to assess the situation and figure out what's the best option to get the outcome that you want from that situation.
You would have been involved a lot in counter-terrorism with the Rangers wing and with the army in general during the 1980s and 1990s. How serious was the threat posed by paramilitaries to this state, do you think?
Well, obviously, I can't talk specifics, but it was quite significant. I mean, there was 2 major gunships or gun-running operations were uncovered, which led to massive searches throughout the island.
Marita Ann was one of them.
Yeah, and the Claudia. But I think people at the time didn't fully understand the nature of the threat. I mean, there was rumors of like really sophisticated weaponry being brought in. I'm not just talking about machine guns. I mean, surface-to-air missiles, that kind of stuff. So I don't think people at the time really recognized fully the threat that was posed. And now, possibly, we're so far on from the Good Friday Agreement, people tend to forget exactly how bad the situation was. I mean, as we discussed earlier, there was 2 major kidnappings. There was
this is Don Tidy and John O'Grady, yeah.
Like in Dorada Wood, there was a guards recruit and an army private shot dead by the IRA.
That's right. And John O'Grady had his fingers chopped off as a dentist. Fingers chopped off by Desi O'Hare.
Yeah, so I think the situation was a lot more tense, a lot more significant than maybe we certainly, I don't think people fully realised at the time how close the country came to being in a really, really serious situation. But thankfully, between the efforts of the Irish Defence Forces, the Gardaí, and our counterparts in the north, plus political developments, eventually heralded in the Good Friday Agreement, which until last week, with the attempted murder of that PSNI officer, we thought that had gone away, but they haven't gone away.
Yes, that's true. Now you've served overseas quite a lot. I mean, I spoke there in the introduction about you being a peacekeeper. I think your first tour in Lebanon was in '84. Is that correct?
Yeah, my first tour in Lebanon was in 1984, and just as a little anecdote for people in the modern social media world where everything is instant, during a 6-month trip to Lebanon at that time, we were allowed 1 free 10-minute phone call. So when you got there, you figured out when you'd like to make that phone call. That's right. Then you applied through your platoon commander, your company commander, the battalion commander, then it would come back down approved. Then you'd write a letter to your mother saying, "Ma'am, I'm going to ring on such a date," which I did. And then you had to get on the convoy down to the headquarters in Nakura, which I did, queued up in the rain for my 10-minute slot, went in and gave the lady the number, and 2 minutes later, there was no answer. And I said, "What?" She said, "There's no answer." I said, "Can you try it again? You get one more chance." So my mother hadn't got the letter. So I had to go back and repeat the whole process. And when I went to Chad in 2010, I was the company commander, and of the 100-odd troops I had, I think 70, well, at least 65%, I don't think were born the first time I was overseas. But I was often explaining this to them. Like they were texting immediately.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm in N'Djamena, I'm in Gazbaida, and they were so used to that instant communication. Like the concept of having to wait 3 months to ring your wife or your father, your mother, whatever, it's alien to the modern generation.
Certainly is, yeah. Can I just ask you about Lebanon? I mean, obviously we had the death in December of Private Sean Rooney. I mean, you first went there in 1984, so it's almost 40 years, and yet there's still peacekeepers. Is that situation ever going to be resolved, do you think?
Lebanon is a difficult country. It's a beautiful country, and it's a country that I love, and I've lived there on numerous occasions. First of all, the peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, UNIFIL, is there with the consent of all parties to the conflict, which is important because if you don't have that consent, it's going to be very difficult. And it's in terms of peacekeeping, it'd be, I suppose, lightly armed compared to the more robust missions like in the Congo or Mali. One of the issues with Lebanon, of course, is that you have a political party with an armed wing, Hezbollah, and they don't fully buy into how UNIFIL wants to enforce its mandate. Then, on the other hand, you have Israel, which has its own views about what's going on in Lebanon. One of the interesting things about UNIFIL, I think it was late last year, they managed to arrange an agreement between Israel and Lebanon, who were still in a state of war. I mean, but in relation to the maritime boundary, which is very important because there's big gas fields off the western coast of Lebanon and the northwestern coast of Israel. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think it's the first UN mission to negotiate a maritime border treaty, which shows that, like, I mean, a lot of people complain about UNIFIL. Some of the complaints could be justified, some of them are unjustified. But given the problems that they have, we'll say, at a political level and at a regional level, I think that they can be quite effective. I know when I went there first in 1984, you couldn't stand up. At that stage, the Israelis were occupying, say, the southern 10 to 15 kilometers of Lebanon as a security zone. There's no way a lightly armed peacekeeper with no mandate is going to try and, stand up against a Merkava tank. So that's the reason that you have to have a buy-in from both parties. And when the Israelis withdrew in 2000, it was significant that under the auspices of UNIFIL, the Lebanese government and the Israeli government and UNIFIL, all three formed a unit to demarcate the border between the two countries, which hadn't been done since Sykes-Picot after the Ottoman Empire. And it was so exact that and of course, there had to be people coming from both sides to a spot. And normally on the Lebanese side, you had to clear a lane through a lane through a minefield to get to this agreed spot. And the three representatives with GPSs would place like a metal stick or bar into concrete. And sometimes they might be only a few inches apart. And the dead center of that becomes the official designated point. And it's known that they painted the base of it blue, and they got a big blue barrel, like yay high. And they're dotted along the frontier between the two countries. So it's is it going to last? I think it will until there's a full agreement between Israel and Lebanon. So yeah, I can't see it, and it's ironic that UNIFIL, it's the United Nations interim force in Lebanon,
yes,
and it's been interim since 1978. But I don't see it finishing anytime soon, unfortunately.
And you've also had quite a lucky escape yourself in 2006. during the Lebanon, during the war there. Tell us a little bit about that episode.
Yeah, this came out of the blue. I mean, like no one expected that war to kick off. So when I was there, and at that stage, I was there as an unarmed military observer.
This is where Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the mission, UNSO, which is the oldest UN mission, was a family mission. So initially I was working in Israel, living in Tiberias, working on the occupied Golan Heights, and my family were with me. And then that was in late 2005. And then in February 2006, I was transferred to Lebanon. The kids were 5 and 7. And Lebanon was absolutely thriving. Tourism was on the up. New roads were being built. It was just a really great place to be. There was maybe 2 areas of concern. One was the village of Gajar, and the other was the Sheba Farms, both kind of in northeastern Lebanon. But apart from that, it was totally quiet. And then out of the blue, a Hezbollah patrol crossed what's known as the technical fence, which is it's not the border fence, because sometimes it's a defensive fence. Sometimes it's on one side, and sometimes it's a kind of a complicated, which there's no point in going into it here. But however, they crossed into Israel and attacked an Israeli patrol. There was, I think, 4 guys killed and 2 seriously wounded, taken away. Within 10 or 15 minutes, a Merkava tank crossed into Israel to try and see what was going on. It was blown up. So within maybe an hour or something like that, there was about 8 Israeli soldiers killed. And the response was fast and furious. Every single Hezbollah post along the frontier between the 2 countries was taken out. Then they started taking out the bridges over any of the rivers, presumably in an attempt to stop Hezbollah taking these 2 injured soldiers too far north. But it was full on war. I'd been there in '93 and in '96 for 2 7-day wars, which were mainly artillery. It was a standoff. It was artillery and jets and that kind of stuff, helicopter gunships. But this was of a significant nature. And where I was up near the village of Marjayoun, I could look down on the city of Tyre and see the jets dropping bombs on Tyre and see the naval artillery firing into Tyre, where my wife and kids were. They could look up at the horizon where they knew I was, where I was, and see essentially the same thing happening. Eventually, the UN chartered a ship from Cyprus to come and pick up the families. And in UNSO, we had 4 positions along the border. So the idea was that the day before the evacuation, anyone that had family in Tyre, they were trying to organise armoured convoys to bring the guys down to say goodbye, essentially. But where I was in Markaba, we were getting hammered. So when my wife and 2 kids were getting into the lifeboat to bring them out to the ship, I rang her on the phone and I said, "I'll see you when I see you," which is not a great way to end a family mission, I have to say. And then they got into Ireland the following day, thanks be to God. And the day after, the Israelis fired a bunker busting missile into a post just up from me, killing 4 very good friends of mine. And I had to try and identify what was left of them. Not a particularly easy task. That was a fairly full-on, like in the unit I was in, which was 52 unarmed observers, we lost 10% in 3 days. And that's an aspect of peacekeeping that, not everyone kind of knows about. And it's certainly not, I suppose, what you expect when you're an unarmed peacekeeper. But that's the nature of the job. I mean, if it was, a very easy task, then, maybe, like, I think it was Dag Hammarskjöld said, and I'm paraphrasing, peacekeeping isn't for the military, but the military are the only people that can do it. Something along those lines. Which, I've kind of often pondered about that. But 2006 was a bit rough. But
and there was a shell which landed very close to you. Is that right?
That was in '93, and I was in the village of Brashit, and it was part of the 7-day war, Operation Accountability, as the Israelis called it, and I was recording the shell impacts in different parts of the village because they were all a violation. And I saw this shell hitting the village and ricocheting, and the village was maybe 2 kilometers from where I was. So I threw myself down on the roof and didn't know where the shell went because there was a lot of other shells falling in the area. But then I got a phone call from the main gate asking me to look over the roof at my prefab. So I looked over the roof, and there was a big hole in the roof of the prefab, and the front door was blown out of it. And I thought, well, what can I do? I'm in the middle of a war. And then a few minutes later, the phone rang again, and the guy said, "Sir, you better look at the canteen." So I looked at the canteen, and there's a 155mm shell lying at the steps of the canteen. So we contacted battalion headquarters. They contacted the liaison with the IDF, who agreed not to shell the road from Tibmeen, which was the battalion headquarters, out to Brashit, where I was, for 3 hours to allow a bomb disposal guy to come out. So this guy rang me and he said, "Kevin, can you get about 60 sandbags so that we can, try and nullify the effects of the blast when I blow the shell?" And I said, okay. And I have this marvelous picture of 6 guys in flak jackets and helmets ferrying sandbags this way. And then just opposite them is 6 guys dressed the same, ferrying all the beer out of the canteen because the canteen was going to be destroyed. But it's sometimes you can have moments of comedy in the middle of a war. In the middle
of a serious situation. We're now at the moment in the most serious armed conflict since the Second World War on the continent of Europe, and a lot of people are looking at the Irish Defence Forces and saying that we're not really up to speed at all and where we should be at as the Defence Forces, given the uncertainty that's in the world at the moment. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a fair point. I think the Defence Forces have been underfunded, under-resourced, undervalued by various governments. And it's not just in the last few years, it's been going on for decades. We can't patrol effectively our airspace. We can't patrol effectively our sea space. There was a Russian ship recently probably checking fibre optic cables or whatever off the coast. I'm not sure how many Navy ships are mothballed now, but we are trusting the protection of the country airily to our colleagues in England, who regularly, if they see Russian planes coming close, it's them that fly up to intercept them because we don't have the capability. There's all sorts of issues about cybersecurity and investment in that, but this isn't. I mean, even if a magic wand was waved by the current government to say, right, this is it, we see the writing on the wall, we want to be able to protect ourselves as a nation, it's going to take quite an amount of time to build up that capability and build up the people capable of flying attack jets if we ever bought them, capable of running serious cybersecurity units, more effectively patrolling our coastal waters. But it's worrying. I think people are gradually beginning to see, based on the invasion of Ukraine, that maybe it's time we sort of woke up and thought we really need to sort out our defence forces to make sure that they're capable of doing what they should be able to do.
No, there's been talk by the Irish government of giving aid to Ukraine. Obviously, we've given a lot of humanitarian aid. There's more than 70,000 Ukrainian refugees here. But is there anything more we should be doing from a military point of view to help the Ukrainians?
There is and there isn't, I suppose, is the way I'd phrase the answer to that. I don't think we have sufficient military resources that we could give to the Ukrainians based on like the amount of stuff they're getting from NATO countries and from the US and all that kind of stuff. I think there's one area that where we do have significant knowledge and expertise, and that's the whole area of what we call in the military EOD, explosive ordnance disposal. So, like our NCOs and officers have decades of experience, not just of dealing with devices, both at home and abroad, but also like developing techniques to deal with things remotely. So I think that whole area of A, dealing with mines, and B, dealing with unexploded ordnance is certainly an area that I think we could contribute significantly. Because as I said, like our resources, we'll say in javelins, the anti-tank weapon, based on the way they go through javelins, I think we'd probably be laughed at. But it might be one thing to consider, because like these things have a shelf life, and if they're not used,
we're not going to be firing them many times.
No, but I think it'd be nice to see some of that stuff going. But as I said, I think one of the areas that we could play a vital role is in that whole area of mine clearance, demining, and dealing with unexploded ordnance.
What do you think of us being a neutral country? Is it time we consider joining NATO, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think to be neutral, you need to be able to defend yourself. So you need to have that conversation about let's be able to defend ourselves first, and then make a decision about whether we join NATO. I mean, we're already working with our European counterparts in various missions. I was in Mali with the European Union training mission to help train the Malian army. So I personally, I don't have an issue with NATO, but I think that's a further step. I think first of all, we need to be in a position that we can defend ourselves as a country, both in the air and the land and on the sea. And then maybe have a conversation about joining NATO. But we're certainly not in a position to even consider it, because we have our strength, I think, has fallen to, I could be wrong, but something like 8,000, something like that. And I mean, that's our Navy, our Air Force, and our Army. And considering our overseas commitments as well, things like the European Battle Group is another area that we should probably get more involved in before we even have that conversation about NATO. But until we adequately resource and pay our troops, I mean, they're talking with their feet. I was having this conversation with a colleague yesterday, and it's a sad indictment. Like I spent 34 years in the Permanent Defence Forces, plus another 7 in the reserve, and there is no way I could recommend the Irish Defence Forces as a career for either of my kids.
That's harsh, yeah.
It's a very sad thing for me to say, because I gave half my life to this organisation and thoroughly enjoyed it, but I'm cognizant of the fact that there's so much kind of wrong with the Defence Forces at the moment. I mean, you have people from Donegal going to do a 24-hour duty in Dublin. You have people from Galway going down to Cork to do a 24-hour duty and coming back. And because the numbers are getting fewer, and the pressures, between going to Port going overseas, the strain on everyone at every level, private, sergeant, captain, commandant, is huge, and people are actively looking for the exit strategy, as opposed to like years ago, it was a career for life. For me, it was a career for life, but people aren't looking at it that way. And the amount of skills and expertise, like some of my colleagues in the range wing, like it takes years to train some of the skills that they require. And you know, if one of them decides, right, I'm not being rewarded for my time overseas, my time away from my family, I'll get a job with a private company. And unfortunately, that's the way.
That's what's happening.
Yeah, it's sad to see, but it's indicative of the fact that, as I've said, successive governments have done very little to effectively fund and resource one of the key parts of the defence of the nation.
Where do you see Irish peacekeeping going in the coming years?
I think, first of all, the deployment of Irish peacekeepers overseas, which started, of course, in the Congo, has always been significant in what it does for the training and experience of the troops at home, because you're exposing people to not just new cultures in your countries, but also to sometimes a small bit of danger, sometimes a big bit of danger. But I mean, if you're in the military, you can't shy away from the fact that at some stage you're going to be under fire.
Yeah.
So it's been I think it's been very beneficial for the defence forces, and also our interoperability with other countries. Like in Lebanon, we've traditionally worked very well with the Norwegians, the Finns, the Swedes, the Norwegians. And we'll say in Mali, we're working with the Germans, with the British Army, loads of other different, the French. And it's a good experience for our junior leaders at NCO level and junior officers to have that experience in a kind of a multicultural organisation. And a lot of them, of course, would be NATO countries as well. So where are we going to go with it? It's difficult to predict where peacekeeping is going to go, because like there's a lot of talk at the moment about mandates for peacekeeping missions, and as we discussed earlier on, the trend is certainly with some missions, because of the robust nature of the environment, that the mandates become more robust. Like the mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, they introduced a concept of adjusting the mandate to allow for more robust offensive operations, and they developed a thing called the Force Intervention Brigade, which was specifically designed to deploy special forces, attack helicopters, all sorts of essentially war fighting material to take on one of the big armed groups in the northeastern part of the country called the M23 movement. That may be the way missions go. I'm not wholly sold on the effectiveness of that concept, because it's one thing to have a robust mandate, but the TCCs, the troop contributing countries, have to be able to enforce the robust nature of the mandate. And if for various reasons, whether politically, technically, or professionally, they can't do it, well then the mandate is not worth the robust nature of that mandate.
Okay. Finally, I'll ask you just about your current role as a security advisor to the UN in South Sudan, the world's newest country, South Sudan. Is there any sign of the Sudanese people getting peace anytime soon?
Well, I retired in November 2016, and I managed to get a short-term contract in the mission in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, as Chief Security Operations. And I ended up spending 4 years there before moving next door to South Sudan, where I am now. And in both countries, the level of violence is significant, but it's first of all, it's nothing to do, in my opinion, with religion. It's mainly inter-ethnic violence. Like in 2017, I was in charge of an area about the size of Ireland, I suppose, And in my first week in the headquarters there, one group attacked another group, and there was 95 people killed. And of course, it doesn't get a mention here. A lot of people probably don't even know that the Central African Republic is bigger than France, but that's actually even a country. And in South Sudan, you've maybe 64 main ethnic groups, all with their own language, culture, beliefs, and most of them hate each other. And then add to that, a big problem which you have in Car as well is the yearly violence between the cattle herders and the farmers. Two like diametrically opposed people, because the farmers are farming and the cattle herders move their cattle, and that's been going on since time immemorial. It's sad to see, because both countries have a lot of potential. Some of the friendliest people in the world I've met in both countries. Like a lot of places, those in power want to hold on to power and not kind of fully think of the responsibilities to their own citizens. Like in Car, people, and Car is the size of France, and people would say that the government's remit extends to piquet douze, and piquet douze is piquet point kilometre 12, so 12 kilometres from the centre of Bangui, the capital. That's it. A lot of people would say that, and I've spoken to some of the rebel leaders there, and they could say with some justification, like, what has the government ever done for us? Where's the hospitals, the schools, the roads? So it's sad. Actually, when the first time I was in Africa in 2010, I read a very good book called Blood River by a guy called, I think, Tim Butcher, and he was recreating a journey down the Congo River that his grandmother and her female friend did back in the day, with trains and cars and all that kind of stuff. And he was describing, and he had to do most of it on the back of a motor taxi because there was no roads left. But he was in some really large town, like 15, 20,000 people. And he was explaining that in Europe, if you look at technology, the grandparents wouldn't be much good with mobile phones. Parents are probably a bit okay, but the kids fly it.
Yeah.
In this town, the grandparents knew what a telephone was. They knew what a hospital was. They knew what a train and a railway was. The parents kind of knew, and the kids hadn't a clue. And I thought that was one of the saddest things that I had kind of read.
It's just gone so backwards now.
Yeah, and I mean, like these countries are so rich. Like the DRC, the minerals there is extensive. Coltan, gold, diamonds. Yeah. Same in Car, same in South Sudan. But it's the way the resources are utilised by the powerful, and sadly, I can't see not in the immediate future. I can't see a change to that.
Okay, Kevin, that was Kevin McDonald. Thank you very much for your time.
You're more than welcome.
You can see all our videos on GTV. Please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.